Accueillons donc Stefan Ihrig, vous êtes professeur d'histoire à l'université de Haïfa. Je laisserai notre présidente de séance vous présenter plus précisément. Claire Mouradian, merci infiniment donc, de conduire cette rencontre aujourd'hui aux côtés de Stefan Ihrig. Nous avons préparé ce rendez-vous également avec l'Union Générale Arménienne de Bienfaisance, l'UGAB Europe, qui notamment dans le cadre qui œuvre notamment dans le cadre du projet Ideas and Their Consequences, Genocide and International Justice after 1919, qui est soutenu par le programme Europe for Citizens de l'Union européenne. Pour ce faire, Céline Goulekian, vous nous direz un petit mot de ce programme dans lequel s'inscrit aussi cette conférence et Stefan Ihrig participera également à un séminaire très important qui se prépare bientôt, dont vous nous direz quelques mots. Avant de vous céder tout de suite la parole pour l'introduction, pour le petit mot, Céline Goulekian, et puis ensuite l'introduction de Claire Mouradian avant la conférence de Stefan Ihrig, simplement pour le public, quelques éléments d'information. Stefan Ihrig s'exprimera en anglais. Vous pourrez l'écouter en choisissant dans l'onglet interprétariat de l'écouter en français. Donc, deux interprètes assureront l'interprétariat vers le français ce soir pour vous. Pour ceux qui nous écoutent par le biais des réseaux sociaux, il n'y a pas de traduction. L'outil ne le permet pas, mais vous pouvez nous rejoindre à tout moment dans le Zoom. Vous vous inscrivez sur le site internet du mémorial et vous pouvez tout à fait nous retrouver si vous souhaitez pouvoir bénéficier de l'interprétariat des propos qui seront tenus ce soir. Suite aux premiers échanges, on aura ensuite un temps de questions du public, soit oralement par le biais de main levée, soit par écrit, et je lirai donc vos questions à nos invités. Merci beaucoup et à tout à l'heure. Donc d'abord, Céline Goulekian, vous dites un petit mot sur le programme et puis ensuite, c'est Claire qui débutera, Claire Mouradian, la conférence ce soir. Merci.
Bonsoir à tous et merci Pauline pour cette introduction. Donc en effet, cette rencontre a lieu également dans le cadre d'un projet européen qui, à travers un cycle de conférences et de séminaires, vise à examiner l'héritage de la Première Guerre mondiale et son impact sur l'histoire européenne du XXe siècle. C'est un projet qui est mené par l'Union Générale Arménienne de Bienfaisance, l'UGAB Europe, que je représente ce soir, en partenariat avec la Lepsius House à Potsdam, avec l'Union européenne des étudiants juifs, l'EUJS, et avec l'organisation Rome Pirène à Mensa. C'est un projet qui a également le soutien du programme L'Europe pour les citoyens de l'Union européenne. Et il est intitulé donc Ideas and Their Consequences, Genocide and International Justice after 1919. C'est donc un projet qui se concentre principalement sur deux courants contradictoires qui se sont développés dans la période de l'entre-deux-guerres, à savoir d'une part l'émergence d'une justice internationale et des grands mouvements humanitaires qui sont venus en aide aux victimes, notamment celle du génocide de 1915, et d'autre part à l'essor d'idéologies politiques radicales qui ont été les fondements des pires atrocités que le siècle aura encore à connaître à travers l'expérience de la Shoah. Pour en savoir plus sur ce projet, et notamment sur la conférence internationale qui aura lieu à Berlin cet été, avec entre autres la participation de Stefan Ihrig qui est avec nous ce soir, je vous invite à consulter le site du projet dont vous pourrez trouver le lien dans le chat. Il me reste à remercier le Mémorial de la Shoah pour ce partenariat et à vous souhaiter une belle soirée en compagnie de Claire Mouradian et de Stefan Ihrig. Merci.
Bien, bonsoir à tous. Merci au Mémorial, merci pour cette organisation, ainsi qu'à Céline et à l'UGAB pour avoir eu cette idée, en lien, comme l'a évoqué Pauline, avec l'exposition au Mémorial de Drancy sur le génocide des Arméniens, qui a repris dans une certaine mesure l'exposition faite en 2015 pour le centenaire à Paris, mais que l'on a un peu rénovée, augmentée, notamment avec une partie importante consacrée au négationnisme. Et donc, je crois tout à l'heure, Stéphane va nous parler. Je suis particulièrement heureuse voilà, qu'il soit avec nous et puis d'avoir pu le rencontrer, parce que je connais ses ouvrages, et notamment les deux importants dont il va sans doute nous reparler ce soir, consacrés au rôle d'Atatürk dans la pensée nazie et puis à la façon de justifier le génocide de Bismarck à Staline. On montrera peut-être les couvertures tout à l'heure. Donc, je suis vraiment très heureuse d'avoir cette occasion de le rencontrer parce que je ne l'avais pas encore fait jusqu'à présent. Et puis, j'espère que ce sera un jour en présentiel et non plus en Zoom, comme nous sommes condamnés tous à faire en ce moment nos présentations. Donc, Stéphane est professeur à l'université d'Haïfa depuis 2016. Il est aussi depuis 2020 directeur du journal of Holocaust Research qui est publié par cette université. Il est passé avant cela, par différentes universités et instituts de recherche prestigieux en Allemagne, aussi à Jérusalem. C'est un spécialiste d'histoire politique. Il a fait des études de droit et d'études politiques. Il a soutenu sa thèse à l'université de Cambridge sur les relations germano-turques. Il a aussi une recherche plus ancienne sur la Moldavie post-soviétique et notamment la reconstruction identitaire. Et donc, ce qui fait qu'il s'est aussi intéressé à ce monde-là, donc ce qui est intéressant, je pense, pour son propos aussi. Et depuis plusieurs années, donc, il travaille principalement sur l'Allemagne. On peut dire que c'est un historien de l'Allemagne, même si c'est aussi un historien devenu de la Turquie, enfin, qu'il a une composante turcologique importante. Et il s'est intéressé à l'élaboration, notamment, de son idéologie nationale, sur la généalogie du nazisme et de la Shoah, avec une analyse approfondie et renouvelée de l'influence du modèle prototype turc et du génocide des Arméniens. Alors, le poids de la relation avec la Turquie, de l'Empire ottoman finissant à la naissance de la République turque sous l'égide de Kemal, dont Stéphane s'est donc aussi fait le spécialiste, est un aspect qui a été largement négligé aussi bien par les spécialistes de l'Allemagne ou des spécialistes d'histoire européenne donc à l'époque contemporaine. Alors, il a d'ailleurs d'autres ouvrages aussi en projet qui poursuivent un petit peu cela, mais pour des périodes encore plus contemporaines sur les Allemands et leurs Turcs. Alors, il remonte aux croisades, mais jusqu'à nos jours. Donc, je pense que ça traitera aussi de l'importante émigration turque en Allemagne, et ce que cela fait aussi à l'Allemagne. Et puis, il a aussi un ouvrage en projet sur une nouvelle lecture du XXe siècle. Alors, pour un peu resituer ses articles, enfin son travail, sa recherche plus généralement, pour trouver, il a une belle fiche Wikipédia où il y a presque pas l'intégralité de ses articles, mais aussi sur le site de son université où il y a une bibliographie importante. Là, on présentera peut-être en image que les titres de ces deux ouvrages concernant plus particulièrement le génocide des Arméniens. Donc, très tôt, il y a eu des articles, des pamphlets sur l'influence de l'Allemagne sur la Turquie, sur son armée, sur la formation de ses élites, sur son gouvernement, sur son rôle dans le génocide des Arméniens. Je ne citerai que la petite brochure de Pichon, Le massacre des Arméniens, travail turc, méthode allemande, qui était une brochure de propagande pendant la guerre, mais publiée en 1916, mais qui situe déjà le fait qu'on s'intéressait aux relations germano-allemandes. Il y a eu bien sûr de nombreuses condamnations des adversaires pendant la guerre ou à la conférence de la paix, et puis aussi les Allemands eux-mêmes ont travaillé à l'époque sur ces questions-là. Par la suite, il y a eu des travaux qui soulignaient l'implication allemande dans le crime, comme ceux de Dadrian ou de Wolfgang Gust. Mais il y a aussi des recherches plus générales sur ces liens. Je pense au travail de Dorothée Guimard sur impérialisme et nationalisme, l'Allemagne, l'Empire ottoman et la Turquie, de 1908 à 1933, qui est une thèse soutenue je crois que c'était à l'EHESS ou à l'Université de Strasbourg, je ne sais plus, mais enfin, en tous les cas, qui a été publiée en 2009. Mais ce qui est nouveau dans la recherche de Stéphane, c'est d'une certaine façon d'inverser les regards, de souligner moins l'influence de l'Allemagne sur la Turquie, je crois, mais l'influence de la Turquie sur l'Allemagne, ou les interactions, surtout entre les idéologies, les visions du monde, les stéréotypes des deux pays, notamment sur les Juifs, et ces deux pays dont le rapprochement a commencé sous Bismarck et Guillaume II, donc au moment de l'unité allemande et de l'essor de l'Empire allemand, qui va se renforcer bien sûr pendant la Première Guerre et après, de la République de Weimar au Troisième Reich. Je rappelle juste pour un lien avec le Troisième Reich, non seulement les évocations par Hitler, la fameuse phrase, mais à la veille de l'attaque, à la veille de l'opération Barbarossa, c'est-à-dire de l'attaque de l'Allemagne nazie contre l'URSS, la Turquie venait juste de signer un traité de commerce avec l'Allemagne, alors qu'officiellement, elle était neutre. Bon, puis on se souvient aussi du rapatriement des cendres de Talaat en 1943, en grande pompe, de Berlin à la Turquie, à Constantinople. Alors au-delà, je crois que dans le travail, mais il me rectifiera peut-être, c'est une quête des racines du phénomène totalitaire auquel s'intéresse Stefan Ihrig et des crimes commis par ces régimes totalitaires. Et c'est une comparaison qu'il fait moins classique que celle qui est faite habituellement entre, par exemple, communisme et nazisme, Staline-Hitler, ou encore nazisme allemand, fascisme italien, Hitler-Mussolini, en ajoutant ici les liens nazisme-turquisme, qui permet d'embrasser ce phénomène du XXe siècle dans une perspective justement d'histoire globale. Cela permet, comme le titre d'ailleurs de son exposé l'indique, de désenclaver l'histoire du génocide des Arméniens, de la sortir de sa marginalisation géographique et chronologique. On a l'habitude de dire c'était loin, il y a longtemps. Ça sera aussi d'une vision orientalisante, assez méprisante d'ailleurs pour tous les protagonistes, donc de conflits interethniques turco-arméniens. Je crois que l'important, c'est justement de se sortir de cette espèce du duo, entre guillemets. Et bien sûr, la réinsertion du génocide dans l'historiographie de la Première Guerre a commencé déjà il y a quelques années, mais voilà, la guerre qui s'est déroulée notamment à l'Est, en général, quand on parle de la guerre en Orient, on s'arrête à Salonique, aux Dardanelles, mais on va rarement jusqu'au Caucase où s'est déroulé l'événement, qui était considéré comme un front secondaire. Et son plaidoyer pour sa réinsertion dans l'histoire européenne, voire mondiale du XXe siècle, eh bien, est une avancée vraiment très importante. Alors, pour venir un peu resituer aussi dans le cadre plus général de l'historiographie du génocide, le négationnisme d'État de la Turquie, dont l'argumentaire en fait n'a pas vraiment varié depuis les massacres hamidiens de 1894-96, ceux d'Adana en 1909, puis en 1516. En clair, il ne s'est rien passé, ils l'ont bien mérité, ce n'est pas le gouvernement, mais les foules en délire, notamment les Kurdes, ou la population exaspérée par les turpitudes des Arméniens qui seraient d'affreux usuriers exploitant le bon peuple turc vaillant et laborieux, ou bien encore des révolutionnaires traîtres à la patrie en danger. Et puis, dernier point de l'argumentaire, on a plus de morts qu'eux, et donc, voilà, c'est un détail de l'histoire. Alors, même si les faits ont été connus en temps réel, s'il y a eu peu de doutes sur la nature même des événements dès 1915. Je rappelle le titre de l'ouvrage de Toynbee, qui bien sûr s'inscrit dans la littérature de guerre sur les atrocités, mais qui s'appelle « Le meurtre d'une nation », donc qui décrit déjà le phénomène, et qui paraît à l'automne 1915, qui analyse déjà le processus en cours. Malgré cette connaissance en temps réel des événements, le négationnisme persistant de l'État successeur et héritier de l'Empire ottoman sur tous les plans, donc c'est un héritier sur tous les plans, plan international, territorial, économique, humain, notamment à travers le recyclage des élites, eh bien, ce négationnisme a aussi stérilisé dans une grande mesure une historiographie centrée sur la preuve des faits qu'il fallait sans cesse apporter. Et en plus, la nécessité d'administrer encore les preuves encore et encore était confrontée en permanence à différentes entraves. La disparition des élites arméniennes d'abord, la dispersion et la misère des survivants, l'accès interdit ou difficile aux sources ottomanes, même s'il y a de nombreuses autres sources pour étudier le phénomène, mais qui sont récusées par les négationnistes, dont on a privilégié souvent les sources des alliés ou des neutres, donc les Allemands, les Austro-Hongrois ou bien les Suisses, les Scandinaves, mais plus rarement, enfin on les a utilisées bien sûr aussi, les sources des ennemis de l'Empire à ce moment-là, les sources russes, les sources françaises, anglaises, américaines, enfin on les a utilisées bien sûr, mais il y avait une espèce de... Et les sources turques seraient réputées bien sûr les plus essentielles. En plus, la recherche s'est toujours déroulée en milieu hostile, aussi bien en Turquie, qu'en Arménie soviétisée, du fait de l'alliance entre Kemal et Lénine, et même aussi parfois en Europe ou aux États-Unis, du fait de la fatigue. C'est un terme qui est revenu à un certain moment, la fatigue face, disons, aux lamentations des victimes, et à une question arménienne que les alliés victorieux s'étaient promis de résoudre, mais finalement ne l'avaient pas fait. Je me souviens d'une phrase du général Buat dans son ouvrage, dans son journal, hein, donc c'est même pas pour la publication, sur le traité de Sèvres, qui était d'une certaine façon caduc, à peine signé, même peut-être avant d'être signé. Lorsqu'il évoque la guerre gréco-turque, il dit que ça va gêner le traité de Sèvres, mais que d'une autre façon, bien, ça les arrange parce qu'on ne veut pas froisser la Turquie. Et ça, il écrit ça en juillet, août 1920. Donc vous voyez que même les alliés n'étaient pas très enthousiastes à l'idée de résoudre cette question arménienne, et puis on utilisait l'argument du chiffre, il n'y a plus d'Arméniens de toute manière. Donc il y a une réactualisation tardive de la recherche. Bon, bien sûr, dans l'entre-deux-guerres, il y a eu des travaux, hein, je pense aux travaux d'André Mandelstam, il y a eu bien sûr différents ouvrages, mais ça a été réactualisé après la Deuxième Guerre, après Nuremberg, après le cinquantenaire du génocide, mais surtout au moment du centenaire, mais au moment où les témoins et les survivants disparaissaient. Et donc, ils avaient été peu audibles avant, et là, ils étaient en train de disparaître. Alors, ces dernières années, il y a une plus grande attention qui est à la fois bienvenue et urgente à la parole des survivants. Il y a des publications et des traductions de nombreux récits de vie. Les travaux de recherche se sont multipliés depuis le 100e anniversaire, avec différentes approches, aussi bien politiques, économiques, sur les biens spoliés, par exemple, sur culturels, sur le rôle de la religion, des stéréotypes, sur l'action humanitaire, sur le sauvetage, sur les justes. Récemment, un film est passé en Belgique, un film sur les justes turcs, aussi, qui est un point intéressant, sur le sort des orphelins. Donc, il y a eu, le champ n'est pas totalement vierge. On a exploré aussi, exploité de nouvelles sources d'archives. Et surtout, ce qui me paraît intéressant, c'est le développement du comparatisme et le dépassement de la tentation de la concurrence des victimes, la concurrence mémorielle. Alors pour moi, comparaison et aussi ce travail de réinsertion que fait Stefan dans l'histoire européenne et plus au-delà l'histoire mondiale est une nécessité épistémologique fertile. Ça doit englober la comparaison des mécanismes de discrimination, d'exclusion de la société, de destruction, mais aussi les mécanismes du négationnisme. Et là aussi, celui du génocide des Arméniens a servi de prototype sur Internet. Par exemple, j'en réfère aux travaux de Karmazin là-dessus. Il y a aussi des interactions entre les deux négationnismes. Par exemple, aujourd'hui, on rencontre une certaine difficulté à enseigner le génocide à l'école, y compris en France, où ça a été enfin intégré dans les programmes scolaires, tardivement, et ça a été finalement intégré. Il y a aussi une journée nationale de commémoration, enfin, il y a eu la reconnaissance officielle de la France, mais on rencontre des difficultés à enseigner le génocide dans certains quartiers, et ça complète ou ça remplace celui de la Shoah. Et on retrouve aussi une similitude des discours de haine et d'exclusion qui sont réactivés par les guerres et les conflits. Donc je pense que c'est tout à fait important de démarginaliser, de déconfiner ce qui se passe aux marges de l'Europe, enfin supposé aux marges de l'Europe, si tant est que marge existe, de décentrer le regard, de sortir d'une vision orientaliste aussi, en bref, d'apporter les éléments pour réinscrire les crimes contre l'humanité dans l'histoire de l'humanité. Et je pense que c'est ce que Stéphane a accompli avec beaucoup de talent, en approfondissant vraiment par les textes, par une recherche minutieuse, par la mise en scène d'acteurs particuliers, par les transferts d'idées, etc., ce rôle de la Turquie dans l'émergence du nazisme. Bon, je le remercie. Alors, si je n'ai pas rendu hommage à l'ampleur de ses travaux, il me le pardonnera, mais je préfère maintenant le laisser parler et je lui reposerai quelques questions après. Et merci beaucoup pour être venu. Donc, voilà, c'était
Thank you very much for this introduction, Claire, and thank you very much for having me, also to Pauline and Céline. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, it's a great honor to talk to you today. To talk to you today about my previous research projects. And this sounds boring enough. Let's try it differently again. I basically call for a total revision and radical rethinking of 20th century history. And I think this is basically what my research is telling me. I barely have a choice in that matter. Let's see if I can show you in this talk what I mean with this. I think what we know today about the Armenian genocide, and what I'm going to briefly sketch here, calls for a revision and a rethinking. Because beyond Armenians and Turks, it had a tremendous effect. It had tremendous ramifications for 20th century history. As already mentioned now in the introduction, denialism and all the mechanism it involves for over 100 years now have put the Armenian genocide in the shadows of history. I think it has to stand actually at the center of many of the main narratives of 20th century history. I think we need to properly integrate the Armenian genocide in the history of the 20th century. And that sounds perhaps humble and agreeable enough, but I think, and I would argue, this is quite difficult. It's much bigger than expected. And indeed, it needs to be something quite revolutionary in whichever way you might choose to include it and to integrate it. I have no easy answers as to how it can be done, how it should be done, and what it would all mean. I can only offer a few perspectives here today. Not only Turks and Armenians need to come to terms, as the phrase goes, coming to terms with history. Not only they need to come to terms with the Armenian genocide, but the world at large too has to come to terms with what happened. It all comes down to the question, what does it all mean? What does it mean if we know to have happened what actually has happened? Was this isolated and bears no connection to what was going on before and what came after? We now have a growing amount of studies that show how we can, or indeed how we need to frame the Armenian genocide within longer and larger developments in the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, spanning at least from the Hamidian massacres of the 1890s all the way to the 1930s in Kemalist Turkey. And this is just following the recent works, for example, by Ümit Ünger or Ümit Kürt. So what are its consequences for the world at large? In many respects, we are still working on some of the basic facts, though we have to admit over the last years, there is a remarkable trend, and it has become very tangible, a trend of intensified consolidation, historiographical consolidation. Consolidation meaning that now we have so many detailed studies that the basic facts are clear, even if certain archives are still not open and available to us. Now, in the last years, we've been ready to move on beyond the basic facts and to look at different and new questions. But you have to admit, we are incredibly late. More than 100 years have passed. A few years ago, I didn't really quite understand how late we really are. But now I understand a little bit better how much was already known about the Armenian genocide at the time it took place over 100 years ago. People not only knew, but the Armenian genocide was part of many contemporary debates. There was nothing marginal about it at all. And I think this finding by itself contradicts starkly to how the Armenian genocide is portrayed in history, in the general histories of the time and of the century today. Denialism has forced upon us a constant need to affirm the basic facts and has marginalized the topic. Denialism perpetuates this impression of marginality of the Armenian genocide in a twofold way. First, it keeps people who know about it very busy and constantly on their toes. As our colleagues know all too well, to expose yourself publicly with this topic involves a lot of energy, often also a lot of negative energy. Secondly, when it comes to our colleagues, the wider field in the historical profession, history teachers and also history researchers and academics, this denialism, it irritates and confuses and makes people who per se don't know much about this topic, the Armenian genocide, makes them a little bit reluctant to casually integrate it into their views and narratives of history. But integrate it we must, not only because of its importance on a factual level as a genocide, but also because it was an important influence on many of the debates at the time. And it was part of many general discussions for quite some time afterwards. The Armenian genocide really did have a huge impact on the world around it. I always like to start with two quotes to underline the contemporary international dimension of the Armenian genocide, right at the time when it took place, both now from Britain and both from during World War I. The first is from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill argued for the use of poison gas at Gallipoli, you know, the famous landings outside of Istanbul. Winston Churchill argued for using poison gas by citing what was happening to the Armenians as proof that the Turks anyway had forfeited the right to civilized warfare. This was behind closed doors in internal documents. But there was also more open talk about it in other contexts as well. Lord Bryce, one of the main and prominent pro-Armenian activists of the time, Lord Bryce argued in an open and published letter to the London Times in October 1915 against aerial bombardment of German cities. During World War I, aerial bombardment of German cities, which people were thinking and talking about, he warned them not to stoop down to the level of barbarism that had been displayed by what was happening to the Armenians at the time. So already at the time, while genocide had just started and was in full progress, in Britain, for example, the Armenian genocide was used as a reference point and as a warning. As our Hungarian colleague Peter Kranitz found in the 1930s, in Hungary, for example, the Armenian genocide was surprisingly often used as a reference point, or rather as a warning in debates about anti-Jewish measures. So, for example, when there was talk about introducing access restriction to Hungarian universities, the numerus clausus, the Armenian genocide came up in debates. This access restriction was introduced clearly as an anti-Jewish measure, and speeches in protest in the Hungarian parliament at the time made explicit references to the Armenian genocide. Genocide was now perceived as a possible endpoint to racial hatred. And then, of course, there's Germany. I always like to start with the example of the writer Franz Werfel, because Franz Werfel allows us to jump right into the middle of things. He makes us pose very key questions, I think. So here we are now. It's the winter of 1932 to 1933. Franz Werfel is traveling Germany in order to warn Germany of Hitler. Hitler's takeover of power seems possible, probable, and to some worryingly imminent. So Werfel toured Germany on a reading tour to read from his still unfinished book. This was, of course, the 40 Days of Musadah. Apparently, he read to German audiences the chapter in which Johannes Lepsius, the main pro-Armenian activist of Germany in these decades, the chapter in which Johannes Lepsius means Enver Pasha, a meeting in which Lepsius pleaded with the Ottoman leader to stop genocide. The 40 Days of Musadah was published in Germany a year afterwards, in late 1933, but it did not have much of a career or life in Germany itself. Third Reich censorship took the book off the market fast, and it was actually surprising that it had been published in the first place. A few copies had been sent out to subscribers, and even some found their way to public libraries. It was rather in the rest of the world that the book that the book embarked upon an astonishing international career. Much later in its career, this book was adopted by Armenians around the world as part of their history. We know that Armenians, including Armenians in Turkey, and even including descendants of the survivors of Musaada, use this book to teach the next generations about their family's history. Back in the 1930s, The 40 Days of Musaada was translated into English and became a bestseller in the United States. There were plans to make it into a major Hollywood movie at the time, but at the intervention of the Turkish government, this was stopped. It was also translated into Polish and Hebrew right away, basically. Most importantly, though, it became one of the most read books of the Nazi-imposed ghettos of Eastern Europe. Marcel Reich-Ranitzky, by far the most famous German literary critic of recent decades, he related in his autobiography that when he was an inmate of the Warsaw Ghetto, this book, The 40 Days of Musaada, quote, enjoyed unexpected success in the ghetto, being passed from hand to hand. Some of the victims of the Holocaust identified with Werfel's book, identified with the Armenians. For some, it inspired hope, such as the ghetto fighters in Bialystok and Warsaw. For many, it also caused further hopelessness. William Michel, who described life in the Kovno ghetto, Lithuania, he wrote in 1942 about reading The 40 Days of Musaada. Quote from William Michel, our analysis of the book indicated that if the world did not come to the rescue of the Armenians who were Christian after all, how could we, Jews, expect help? No doubt, Michel continues, no doubt Hitler knew all about these massacres and the criminal neglect by the free world and was convinced that he could proceed with impunity against the helpless Jews. Our conclusion was that if we were ever able to survive this war, it would not because somebody came to our rescue, but because Hitler ran out of time. So this was William Michel from Kovno. So some of the victims of the Holocaust knew. And we know also that many Jews in Germany knew about the Armenian genocide since the 1920s already, since the early 1920s actually. And still, originally, this book, The 40 Days of Musaada, was meant for Germany and the Germans at large. Why choose the Armenian genocide as a warning for for Germany as a warning against Hitler? Why? Because people knew already what it meant, or even if they would learn about it in the book, the Armenian genocide was already an established reference point at the time. Germany knew of the Armenian genocide, and this is why Werfel chose the Armenian genocide as a medium. He knew exactly what he was doing and why. He said himself in one of his letters that he used the Armenians as his, quote, stand-in Jews. And during the book tour, the audience stood in for Enver Pasha. An article on one of these readings by Werfel at the time claimed that it was clear that Johannes Lepsius was not addressing so much Enver Pasha, but was actually talking to the audience, to the Germans. The Nazis too knew of the Armenian genocide, and we find in their early publications references to it. And as I found in my research, there was a debate around the Armenian genocide in Germany after World War II. A true and rather large genocide debate lasting from 1919 to 1923. Even before the word genocide was coined, obviously it was possible to discuss and understand the murder of a people and the nature of genocide already back then. This is not the place today to go into too much detail on this, but the German public knew or could have known. And the Nazis, they knew too. In their own publications, they mentioned the eradication of the minorities in Turkey, and quite a few times, as one of the key preconditions for the ethnic revival, for the rebirth of Turkey. And they did so already quite from the start of the Nazi Party from the early 1920s. Then in publications of the Third Reich, the new Turkey was glorified as a model ethnic state. And the destruction of the Armenians and the expulsion of the Greeks were explicitly portrayed as necessary preconditions for this rejuvenation of the new Turkey. In the Nazi discourse in Turkey, an image was painted in which ethnic revival and reconstruction was possible, was fruitful, and was to be carried out on the foundation of ethnic cleansing and genocide. In my research, I discuss how the Nazis glorified these various aspects of Völkisch ethnic modernity that they saw in the new Turkey. New cities, factories, infrastructure, young people marching and whatnot. It was always implicitly the image of a post-genocidal country, a post-genocidal wonderland of sorts. This was indeed one of the lessons the Nazis chose to learn from the Armenian genocide. And what's more, interwar Germany and the Nazis knew all too well that the Turks had evaded punishment for genocide. There is still, as you know, a debate over whether Hitler said these famous words, "Who after all speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians?" But I argue we don't need this statement to show that this was what many contemporaries, including the Nazis, understood as a fateful lesson of World War I and its aftermath. The lack of punishment in connection with the perceived flourishing of the new Turkey, they set a dangerous and fateful precedent for the world and for the rest of the 20th century. So what if people fully understood the logic, this logic of genocide? Is there so much to understand anyway before Hitler came to power? I make the argument that they could and that many did, but what does this mean for our understanding of the history of the 20th century? At the very least, the Armenian genocide was a momentous warning that was not heeded by the world. The world knew, but only the wrong people drew the obvious conclusions. Once more, you can get away with oppression, violence, and large-scale murder. So people in the world knew, and this is not a trivial point. I think it is precisely the combination of three factors that make it absolutely necessary for the Armenian genocide to be reintegrated properly into world history, for it to play a very important role there. The first is the factual event and the extent of it. The second is the sheer chronology, at what critical juncture in time it happened. And the third is that the world knew about it, that it was influenced by it, and that the world had to come to terms with what had happened. In the last years, many countries and recently President Biden officially acknowledged the Armenian genocide. Turkey, this is probably not going to happen anytime soon. Okay, again, we know what we know. We produce our knowledge about the Armenian genocide, and now some parliaments and some politicians have listened. But what comes next? How does what we discuss here and in other places connect to the wider world? Is it enough that genocide gets recognized, that is eventually, like Claire mentioned, taught in schools around the world? Thinking about that, what makes me a little bit sad and a little bit hopeless sometimes in the last years working on the Armenian genocide is the denialists and their apparently unbroken power. It's kind of also this realization that except for some rogue colleagues that are pretty much left alone with the knowledge that we produce when it comes to the wider profession of history. Looking at what the grand history and encyclopedias on World War I published now in the last years during the centennial, and there are some exceptions there. Looking at these grand histories and encyclopedias, I was perplexed to find that when it comes to these general histories, we're still stuck at a level many years, if not decades, behind what we're doing here today and also in this larger program and what our colleagues are doing for some time. Often, if the Armenian genocide is mentioned at all in these grand narratives, it goes along the lines of this. The history of the other parts is told, and then this, meaning the Armenian genocide, also happened. Horrible, a little bit exposition, oh, very complicated. Okay, we're going back to the Western Front. Often, indeed, we would have to fight first for a proper inclusion of the Ottoman Empire, of Ottoman history into narratives of World War I as an actual and important part of the war. It's kind of a double marginalization playing out here, a bit like a Russian doll. First, the Ottoman Empire is marginalized, and then within what is left, the Armenian genocide is further treated in somewhat superficial fashion. And here, Turkish denialism works together in tandem with either ignorance or neglect of Ottoman history. In any case, this has contributed to denialism's incredible success over the last 100 years. So what would a good inclusion of the Armenian genocide in such narratives and grand histories look like? How many pages in a grand history of the 20th century or of the Great War should be devoted to the Armenian genocide? Is it sufficient if it gets a nice discussion in 10, 20, or 30 pages? Is that then enough? It is not just another genocide among a series of genocides. Chronology matters, and the influence an event exerts and exerted matters as well. We could mention the genocide of the Herero and Namakwa people in German Southwest Africa, and somebody already mentioned it in the chat here. However, and I'm not a big fan of comparing genocides, but here we're talking about the influence they had. It was not of similar importance for world history, for perhaps many unfortunate reasons. In any case, it is difficult always to compare such things. One of these differences between the Herero and Namakwa genocide to the Armenian genocide is that it was not really understood as a genocide at the time and in the debates when it happened and in the immediate aftermath. And I think this matters. Then a few years later, after this Southwest African genocide, came the Armenian genocide. And as I mentioned, it was discussed at the time and after, and it happened directly in full view of the world. And people at the time understood that it was the deliberate murder of a people. One could mention here American, French, German, and British public debate. Public, not only private debate. But at least since the Armenian genocide entered the world of international media, or rather propaganda at the time, since the summer of 1915, people understood. This was not a colonial crime, this was not normal warfare, and this was not just a series of horrible atrocities against civilians. This was a new category of horror. I think any reintegration of the Armenian genocide into the history of Europe and the world needs to lead to radical changes. Not because perhaps I or you may want it, but because of the nature of the Armenian genocide and what it meant for the world. And I'm sure my research and that of our colleagues on the international reception of it only scratches the surface still. And by the way, I haven't even told you what I found the most shocking of my research. I mentioned that Germany knew, but I didn't really discuss how they came to know, other than there was a large debate. And as I'm now shortly going to describe how Germany came to terms with genocide, please do not judge Germany too quickly. You could always say Germany was a little bit confused and a little bit disturbed in these immediate after-war years in the 1920s. You can always blame some sort of barbarism on the Turks or the Young Turks for the genocide, but all this anyway doesn't bring us very far. You could look at it like this. Violence, an incredible potential of violence of humans against humans came from the colonial space, where it had already reached genocidal proportions, back to Europe. As I said, the Herero and Namakwa genocide evoked interpretations of crimes, also barbarism of colonial crimes against humans, who were only partially considered equal to whoever was debating about them in Germany and Europe. But then with the Armenian genocide, you had basically, and this is about the perception more than anything else, you basically had white people kill white people. All of a sudden, all this was not so far away anymore. And interestingly, Germany in those years was not prone to dismiss the Turks as Oriental barbarians. They rather identified with the Turks as against them. And then there was the whole problem of how to explain it, especially for a Germany that was to a large degree pro-Turkish. The victims, after all, were fellow Christians. This constellation alone made things difficult. Germany, as already in the decades before, had recourse to race as the explaining factor. Race basically provided a way out of this explanatory conundrum. Not so much the racial characteristics of the Turks, but rather of the Armenians. Since the 1890s, and this is of course also the time when modern racial anti-Semitism begins to seep into public discourse and become more important there, since the 1890s, Armenians were often in Germany portrayed as, quote, the Jews of the Orient. And indeed, you could go as far to argue that German anti-Armenianism was an exact carbon copy of modern racial anti-Semitism. Now, justifying violence or just being a bystander to horrible atrocities is not easy. It's not an easy thing for humans to do. Even if you're only a virtual bystander through the media and through your proxy, your government. I have no idea how you and how we are rationalizing all these horrible things that have happened in our lifetime or in recent years in far away or sometimes very close places. How we rationalize why we do not help those in need of our help. So let us also not be too quick in judging the Germans of the 1920s. Perhaps we are different, but not entirely. It's a tricky thing to be a bystander to violence, especially if violence happens for an extended period of time, and even more so if it is committed by your allies. And so Germany got caught up in a strange, bizarre, and highly immoral discursive logic. First, pro-Turkish circles tried to downplay and deny violence. Then they felt they had to justify the violence that had taken place. And then they also had to justify Germany's role as a bystander or enabler. And finally, they went overboard and justified violence as such, justifying genocide. It had happened before in the 1890s, the Armenian massacres, and it happened to some extent during the war. And then it happened again in the genocide debate of the early 1920s. So I have mentioned that there was a big debate after World War I, and that people in Germany could have known and knew to some extent. This already seems to upset the belief that knowledge of a genocide might help to prevent the next. It already speaks to some of the problems that Holocaust education experts have identified. How you actually reach the goals of Holocaust education. We assume certain outcomes and conclusions, but things are not so easy in practice. Previously, there was this idea that because Germany did not know of the Armenian genocide, or at least because it didn't come to terms with it in the interwar years, this then enabled the Holocaust to take place. Sounds reasonable enough, but it's not true, not at all. It knew, and in quotation marks, came to terms with it. It just came to terms with it in a totally different fashion that we would hope or expect. So there was a large genocide debate from 1919 until 1923, and the pattern of reaction I described played out. Awareness of the genocide was created and disseminated, then followed a denialist backlash. Then Talat Pasha, the author of the Armenian genocide, was assassinated in Berlin. And because of the acquittal of his Armenian assassin, Soman Telerian, by a Berlin court, the debate heated up again in Germany. This acquittal, by the way, took place exactly 100 years today. More information and a broad acceptance of the charge of the murder of a people, a quote from the time, murder of a people of genocide. This is what came immediately after this acquittal and in this new surge in debate. The evidence now present in the public sphere, and you have to remember that already a little bit before, in 1919, Johannes Lepsius, this German giant of pro-Armenian activism, Lepsius had published a collection of documents from the German Foreign Office on the Armenian Genocide. This and now the debates in the meantime and the debates around the assassination and the trial. There was so much knowledge in the public sphere. It was so overwhelming that even the former denialist pro-Turkish camp had to acknowledge the murder of the Armenian people. But then they went another step too far. But it was totally consistent with their logic, and they went on to justify genocide per se. Not that these voices were necessarily a majority of Germans at the time, not even necessarily of the printed public discourse, but they were loud and they were heard, and this over quite a period of time. And they had pretty much the last word on the topic. Again, the topic came up in 1922 when two more Young Turk leaders heavily implicated in the Armenian genocide were assassinated in Berlin, again in Berlin. And now the German far-right papers immediately started spouting their poison against Armenians and Jews in Germany and called for, quote, an ethnic surgeon. Then in 1923, the Armenian genocide was only part of the background discussions of the Treaty of Lausanne. But here again, at least implicitly so, it was clear that this new Turkey had achieved something spectacular and miraculous and was now, for the far right, solid on the foundation of ethnic cleansing and genocide without punishment. This was the interpretation in Germany at the time, and cynically speaking, this was indeed a bit the message that was sent to the world at the time. This was a major lesson of World War I, and the Nazis and many others knew it and heard it loud and clear. A perpetrator nation of large-scale atrocities and even of large-scale genocide could go unpunished. It could even get to enjoy the material fruits and benefits of genocide. This, I would argue, is the original sin of the 20th century. So what now could such an integration of the Armenian genocide in the 20th century history actually look like? Perhaps it should make us shift focus on what actually characterized the 20th century. Perhaps we are even still living in a very long 20th century. As you know, historians try to make sense of the past from a distance and to identify broader eras of development. We usually classify modernity as to have started in the late 18th century with the American and French revolutions. Often the time from 1789 until the beginning of World War I is seen as a long 19th century. And what followed is usually the short 20th century, which ended with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The 1990s, from which many of these ideas about the 20th century come, were a time of euphoria. This was a time when Francis Fukuyama famously spoke of the end of history, but as the besieged city of Sarajevo reminded us, history tortuously continued. Perhaps the 20th century is in retrospect less characterized by the big ideologies than by a new aggressive state that sought to mold its citizenry into more perfect units. A new modern state that had and has still unparalleled powers of control, coercion, and physical violence. A new state that was willing to send millions of its men to their death at the Western Front, and a new state that was so often willing to kill off its own citizens of a certain ethnic background when it suited political and ideological situations. State sovereignty seems like a dangerous weapon in this perspective. And empirically speaking, it is hard to contradict this claim. One could counter by mentioning the rule of law, the separation of powers and checks and balances, but we are yet to see and to retrospectively know just how entrenched these and how entrenched democracy as a whole really are in our modern world. The marriage of democracy and the modern state is but a short episode in human history, at least so from the bird's eye of the historian. It's still a fairly young flower, and we still have to see how many more winters it can weather. Who knows, perhaps we're living through a period which will one day be seen as a perverted era of enlightened modern dark ages, in which we had the means, the knowledge, and often the will, however faint, to save the thousands and millions of people from being killed by their own states and governments, but did and could not do it. The Allies, after all, did not wage war against Hitler in order to stop the Holocaust. Nobody intervened militarily to save the Armenians during World War I. Through a few military interventions to save citizens from their overlords were successful, and often enough, humanitarian intervention was a mere fig leaf of a pretext anyway. Humanity's track record of saving humans from state-level domestic violence and murder is frankly appalling. And once more, and this is my argument a little bit, this matters not only on a factual level, but also in respect to what it does to us as humans. Humanity has, over the course of the last 100 years, and much more so than ever before, humanity has become a continuous bystander to large-scale violence happening somewhere right now, or at least in very frequent intervals. And since over 100 years, since the late 19th century, really our societies are closely connected and interlinked worldwide. Mass media societies who devour news from at home and abroad and have to come to terms with what they are exposed to on a daily basis. What kind of traumata and distorted justifications all the violence of the last 100 years has provoked in all the individual bystanders, we can only imagine. One distant bystander went far, but few go down such a path, and anyway, he was much more than a bystander in many respects. Raphael Lemkin would become the father of the term genocide and of the United Nations Genocide Convention. This Polish Jew, whose family later perished in the Holocaust, had one of the most formative experiences of his life, as he tells us in his autobiographical texts. He had one of his most formative experiences when he read in the year 1921, 100 years ago in that summer, in his newspapers about a trial taking place in Berlin. This was the trial of the assassin of Talat Pasha, the mastermind behind the Armenian Genocide. Raphael Lemkin later remembered that he had asked his law professor in Krakow at the time why it wouldn't have been possible to convict Talat Pasha of the crimes he had committed against the Armenians in a court of law outside of his home country. His law professor answered with a parable that focused on state sovereignty. He said, consider the case of a farmer who owns a flock of chickens. He kills them, and this is his business. If you interfere, you are trespassing. Lemkin responded in shock, but the Armenians are not chickens. In his memoirs, Lemkin wrote that at that moment, quote, my worries about the murder of the innocent became more meaningful to me. I didn't know all the answers, but I felt that a law against this type of murder must be accepted by the whole world. Sovereignty, Lemkin writes, cannot be conceived as the right to kill millions of innocent people. Well, you might flat out reject what I've said now about sovereignty in this part and disagree with me and say the 20th century was about something else. You may dismiss this part of my talk right away, and frankly, I don't mind if you do. My main point is that the Armenian Genocide and an integration of the Armenian Genocide into European and world history must make us radically rethink and question some of the core tenets of the period that it touches upon. World War I, the 20th century, modernity as such, and so on. The Armenian genocide, the debates it provoked, and the knowledge that was generated about it, about human cruelty and about genocides as such, they were around and they had an impact on the world. I always like to close with the following quote because I find it very meaningful, especially in such a context as this one today. It's a quote from the aftermath of the 1890s Armenian massacres, but I think it encapsulates what is also true on a larger scale for the Armenian genocide. It's a comment made by a pro-Armenian activist and a colleague of Johannes Lepsius. It's made by Martin Rade. He was looking back at how the pro-Ottoman sections of the German press had again and again, continually for a few years, justified the violence perpetrated against the Armenians. He was wondering what being exposed to violence in the media in the 1890s and their constant either denial or justification, what all this might do to the readers, to the audiences in Germany. Rade wrote, quote, "It is impossible to appreciate what kind of an impression the fashion in which society and the press are discussing the Armenian horrors will make on the generation of men growing up today. They are learning to worship an idol of opportunism and real politics, which, if it becomes dominant, will cleanse away all noble dispositions." End of quote. Now, I can only imagine what effect the debates around the Armenian genocide after World War I had in Germany and in other countries. Equally, of course, I also often wonder what kind of cynicism the international helplessness vis-a-vis wars in the recent years and decades had as a long-term effect on all of us in the world as bystanders of the various wars themselves, and to the justification by our various governments as to why we cannot help. I cannot imagine what kind of an effect denialism of the Armenian genocide had over the last 100 years on the various bystanders in the world. When in the summer of 1915, the Armenian genocide reached the international media public, it came immediately with its shadow, denialism. Denialism in the Armenian case really is as old as the genocide itself. And indeed, as is often claimed, denialism is part of the genocide or the genocidal process itself. Then we are today still in a very special position with the Armenian genocide. In this way, denialism, this genocide is not even over yet, it's still ongoing. And in the meantime, I believe through this denialism, as well as all other cynical and justifying arguments brought forward to justify violence and killing, all of this is brutalizing the world. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphane, pour cette présentation très riche et très à la fois un peu, enfin à la fois stimulante, un peu désabusée, un peu en même temps quand même optimiste dans le projet de réinscrire l'histoire du génocide dans l'histoire de l'Europe et l'histoire mondiale, ce dont je suis tout à fait d'accord. Souvent dit que c'était une histoire européenne à plusieurs degrés aussi, pas simplement parce que ça se passe quelque part malgré tout, peut-être aux confins de l'Europe, enfin il faudrait définir la notion de confins, mais à travers les idéologies mises en œuvre, à travers les liens entre les différentes sociétés, à travers plein d'éléments, à travers effectivement ce que vous venez d'évoquer sur les répercussions dans les débats sociaux, dans les débats politiques, pas seulement en Allemagne d'ailleurs, et je pense dans d'autres pays aussi, qu'ils aient été mêlés ou pas à cela. Et je pense que reprendre comment vous avez terminé, ça brutalise effectivement, le négationnisme brutalise la société et ouvre quand même la voie avec l'impunité à d'autres à d'autres phénomènes identiques, mais ça brutalise au premier chef, bien sûr, la société arménienne, mais aussi la société turque. L'un des éléments aujourd'hui, d'ailleurs, on le retrouve chez un certain nombre de collègues courageux en Turquie. Ils pensent que, disons, la reconnaissance du génocide n'est pas qu'une question morale, mais c'est aussi une question hautement politique dans la voie de démocratisation de la société, enfin, pour une démocratisation de la vie politique en Turquie même. Alors, je voudrais poser, peut-être pour lancer le débat, mais bien sûr, j'espère que le public en posera aussi, certaines, à la fois ou remarques ou questions. D'abord, dans les aspects un petit peu, alors il y a des aspects, par exemple, sur la conjonction des stéréotypes à la fois antisémites et anti-arméniens, des phrases que l'on retrouve quasiment identiques. Je voulais une question aussi d'indifférence à l'égard de ce qui se passe au loin, de ce qui se passe même parfois quand ça se passe sous nos yeux. Je pense au Rwanda, entre autres. Je voudrais poser des questions, enfin, remarques, questions sur d'abord la vision que l'on a des confins. Qu'est-ce qu'on appelle les zones de marge? Qu'est-ce qu'on appelle des confins? Effectivement, vous avez évoqué le fait qu'il fallait aussi davantage étudier la Turquie dans la Première Guerre, parce que la Première Guerre, en général, enfin, il y a une masse de travaux sur les tranchées de Verdun ou de la Somme, enfin, bref, tout ce qui se passe sur le front ouest, mais il y en a beaucoup moins sur les fronts orientaux, et encore moins sur ce que je disais tout à l'heure, le front caucasien, qui à l'époque est aussi considéré comme un front secondaire, y compris par les protagonistes. Peut-être moins les Turcs que les Russes, mais néanmoins pour les Russes, c'est au départ un front assez secondaire. Alors voilà, il y a cette question des confins à différents niveaux et de ce qui se passe au loin. Vous avez évoqué le rôle des médias, et souvent dans les représentations des médias, vous savez qu'il y a cette espèce de statistique, on divise le nombre de morts par le nombre de kilomètres, et ça devient ou une nouvelle importante ou simplement une brève qui ne mérite pas que l'on s'y attarde. Mais je crois que c'est ça aussi qui peut être voilà, rediscuté. Sur la question de la complaisance ou l'impunité qui commence dès l'époque des massacres arméniens, parce qu'on les connaît, là aussi ils sont médiatisés, mais il n'y a aucune intervention. On espérait par exemple, les Arméniens entre autres, une intervention comme celle qu'il y a eu au Mont-Liban par Napoléon III quelques années avant, et là, non seulement il n'y a pas eu d'intervention, mais on interviendra quelques années après contre la Crète, lorsqu'il y a une révolte, enfin, pour condamner la Grèce, quand il y a une révolte en Crète qui a été écrasée de façon horrible aussi. Donc il y a le rôle des relations diplomatiques et entre puissances, qui chacune à sa façon joue des petites nations comme de pions pour affaiblir son rival en temps de guerre, y compris par l'ingérence humanitaire, et puis pour se réconcilier en temps de paix avec le commerce. Et on a évoqué le fait que les Allemands ont justifié quelque part le génocide, alors qu'il va plus loin, mais il y a d'autres puissances qui se sont accommodées du génocide. Je pense à la Russie, bon, qui une fois les Arméniens massacrés, même s'ils étaient supposés être leurs protecteurs, sont finalement pas si mécontents. Ils pensent repeupler les provinces arméniennes avec des Cosaques. Ils sont débarrassés d'un problème qui leur casse les pieds. Bon, les Français ou les Anglais sont pas contents, mais enfin, je veux dire, à la fin, on s'accommode assez bien quand même de la disparition d'une question qui a occupé toutes les chancelleries européennes pendant le long 19e siècle aussi. Donc, il y a aussi cette question-là. Et donc, les peuples deviennent aussi des variables d'ajustement dans ces relations diplomatiques. Et quelque part, dans cette justification, est-ce qu'il n'y a pas aussi un phénomène des grandes nations qui se comprennent bien entre elles et qui justifient parce que ce sont des empires ou des grands États. Donc, il y a ça aussi qui peut-être rentre en jeu. Il y a l'échec des premiers essais d'enquête internationale, comme il y en avait eu une première tentative lors des massacres hamidiens. Bien sûr des procès, et on est même allé de la condamnation, par exemple la fameuse déclaration du 24 mai 1915 des trois puissances de l'entente, à l'amnistie des criminels, même des criminels nommément cités dans le traité de Versailles, dans le traité de Sèvres. Et donc on a finalement aussi, même au niveau humain direct, on a aussi pas simplement le crime dans son ensemble, mais même au niveau des criminels connus, il y a eu une amnistie. Alors, il y a quelque chose aussi qui ressort peut-être de la confrontation et de la concurrence des empires à l'ère du colonialisme triomphant. Et finalement, effectivement, les pratiques sont pas forcément, vont pas jusqu'au bout les mêmes, mais quand même, il y a des pratiques qu'on retrouve. Et donc, ça rentre aussi peut-être dans la justification. Et puis, il y a des visions en miroir, du mimétisme, des idéologies, donc des pratiques impériales. Par exemple, les pratiques de déportation des sujets supposés ennemis de l'intérieur ne sont pas que dans l'Empire ottoman. Je pense par exemple à la Russie qui chasse aussi, enfin qui éloigne des zones de frontières, les Allemands de Russie, les Juifs, etc., avec aussi beaucoup de violence. Alors, ce n'est pas un but d'extermination, hein, on ne les extermine pas, bien sûr, mais néanmoins, il y a une forme de violence, je pense aux travaux d'Éric Laure là-dessus, qui sont déjà très, 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 très fortes. Et donc, en même temps, je dis, qu'est-ce qui fait que justement, dans ces pratiques de déportation ou d'internement, dans des sujets ennemis, on a aussi des internements en France ou en Angleterre, hein, qu'est-ce qui fait que certains États basculent complètement et d'autres pas? Donc, quelle est la nature de ces États aussi? Donc, ce qui font que certains vont aller jusqu'au génocide, effectivement, et d'autres s'arrêteront peut-être juste un peu avant, même s'il y a beaucoup de violence. Et puis, pour finir, peut-être dans mes questions sur une note semi-positive, ce serait aussi intéressant peut-être d'étudier davantage les lanceurs d'alerte, notamment ceux qui, à travers le génocide des Arméniens ou les massacres antérieurs, ont su comprendre ce qui attendait d'autres peuples, notamment les Juifs, voire ont utilisé ou réutilisé leurs méthodes de mobilisation qu'ils avaient éprouvées en faveur des Arméniens pour les Juifs plus tard. Bon, je pense à Pierre Quillard, hein, qui a été un grand arménophile et en même temps un des chevilles ouvrières du journal pro-arménien, mais qui a été aussi un grand Dreyfusard. Vous avez évoqué Franz Werfel. Je pense aussi au rabbin Wise, qui a aussi œuvré, qui a été aux États-Unis, même si un peu contesté, mais parmi les premiers à alerter sur ce qui se passait. Armin Wegener aussi en Allemagne. Et donc, ce serait aussi peut-être intéressant de voir, disons, pourquoi il y a eu des contrepoids où vous avez évoqué Rade, Lepsus, etc. Il y en a eu d'autres. Voilà, qu'est-ce qui a fait que certains ils ont pas été entendus ou parfois entendus? Donc, c'était un petit peu en vrac, mais enfin un certain nombre de choses qui me sont venues en vous écoutant et je tiens à nouveau à vous remercier pour cette synthèse. Et effectivement, je suis tout à fait totalement d'accord avec vous. Le génocide des Arméniens n'est pas un événement anodin, enfin anodin, jamais anodin, mais je veux dire qui se passait il y a longtemps, très loin et qui pourrait être oublié. Je ne sais pas effectivement combien de pages mémoriques, mais au moins la réflexion sur ce qui s'est passé, ses suites et la façon dont il y a eu les débats, je pense, mérite beaucoup enfin, peut enrichir la réflexion sur tous les phénomènes de violence de notre long XXe siècle qui s'est ouvert par aussi le massacre des Héréros et des Namas, voilà, continué par les Arméniens, les Juifs et d'autres encore, tous les peuples punis d'Urs, il y a eu le Cambodge, il y a eu la Bosnie, il y a eu enfin bref, et le Rwanda, et puis ça continue avec ce que vous évoquiez, non seulement les guerres, mais les violences. Donc c'est important aussi pour voilà, essayer de comprendre tout ça, même si je suis aussi d'accord avec vous que la connaissance n'empêche pas, hélas ne prévient pas, mais n'empêche pas, peut-être qu'elle aide après à un peu prendre mieux en charge les victimes. Enfin bon, je ne sais pas.
Okay, thank you very much. These are so many points. I also had a look in our chat. There was a lot there too. If you allow me, I would like to answer first one of the mentions in the chat because there was a little bit of misunderstanding there. I mentioned the Herero and the Makwa genocide in a specific context, and you know, perhaps even my wording was very cynical and very disappointed, reflecting what happened to it at the time. So this was a colonial genocide that was not phrased in similar terms when it was debated and understood in Germany. There was still similar, what do you say, dynamics, people talking against this crime, people getting information, people starting to lobby against what the government was doing. but basically the classifications, the category were a little bit different. It did have a huge effect on German history as well. As some perhaps know, there were some elections, towards basically the end of the Herero and Namaqua genocide. The German Social Democrats positioned themselves against the imperial government for stopping a genocide for the Herero and Namaqua people. And they were basically rewarded by the electorate and by the opposition by being called traitors of the fatherland, being internationalists and all these things, which is one of the important developments which leads to this so-called peace of the castle in World War I, where the Social Democrats and oppositionals are not criticizing the government publicly and openly. And one of the first things actually during World War I, when they do criticize the government, it is somebody from then the SPD criticizing the government on the Armenian genocide. And this is also one of the many factors that leads to a split within the SPD after World War I. So it is of tremendous importance for world history and also for German history, but it posed a different kind of problem. The difference, was that basically for the people debating, the colonial space was different, and the expectations of how Germany would act in a colonial space was different than what was expected vis-a-vis people like the Armenians. I don't have time to go into detail here, but the Armenians were very tricky for people who were working on history, on the history of race, of the history of nations in these times from the 1890s upwards. We don't have time to get into this, but the Armenians basically speak an Indo-European language. They're one of the oldest, Christian peoples and all of that. It made it very difficult, to justify violence against them. There were not some people far away in Africa or something. They were very close to the European self, They were not really that peripheral, when you look at these debates and, the areas of the world people were interested in. Claire, you said something about the miles, how far away are people and the number of victims and how many media columns in the media they get. What is so interesting, I think, about the Ottoman Empire and the Armenians, in basically all these decades, they are not marginal at all. From earlier already, 1880s, I would say, the Ottoman Empire is very important in Germany, in the German media. It's always most of the time front page news, and this is at a time when newspapers are very slim. They only have like 2.5, 3 pages maximum on politics and such events. And also I need to stress, now connecting to another point as well, I mentioned in my talk a genocide debate from 1919 to 1923. This is actually super shocking and remarkable because these were crazy years for Germany. They had so much going on. People didn't accept the new republic. People didn't agree with the terms of Versailles, of course. People had to struggle financially. There was so much uncertainty that you find so many articles about what happened during the war in faraway Turkey at all is really remarkable. I think still, empirically speaking, if you count the articles in the press at the time and also how big these articles are and how they're placed, it's one of the most important genocide debates in the public ever in the history of humanity. And that this can happen 10 years before Hitler in such turbulent times, this is really remarkable, I think. And this sets the Armenian genocide really apart from what happened before to the Herero and Namaqua people, for example. Okay, there's always a danger that I talk too much, so I'll try to be very short. Claire, you mentioned a whole different range of topics I could talk on for a long time. For me, it's important. I normally don't do comparative genocide studies. I'm not a fan of that. As a historian, I find that very difficult. You mentioned deportation, and for me, this is a good starting point to again elaborate on what I meant by sovereignty as well. There is no accidental genocide, and if you start deporting people as a state, you have a responsibility for them. If you find out on the third day that they don't have enough to eat, you have to step in, or you have to try. If you continue day after day after day after day, then what do you say? The intent is clearly established. The Russian Empire deported Germans and Jews from its western borders. It's also supposed to be asked, how did you take care of them? How, what provisions were given and so on and so forth. But, you know, the Ottoman and Armenian case are clearly apart. You know, we do know, I mean, we always have the telegraph system in the Ottoman Empire. Talat Pasha, who has a telegraph even in his own home, people know what's going on. You know, if there is a time lapse, it's minimal. It's not enough to excuse, you know, people dying and anything. So this won't work. And you are right, there's always this image, you know, of the trains, for example, the comparison to the Holocaust. I think it's a good strategy for us to connect them. But for me, the Armenian genocide is basically this, you know, these tracks on foot, this wild, endless kind of, that's much more for what symbolizes the Armenian genocide for me. I'm sorry if I summarized you incorrectly there, Claire. I don't know if I did.
Non, ce que je voulais dire à propos de la déportation massive des sujets considérés comme des sujets ennemis de l'intérieur, c'était que dans certains cas, on n'est pas allé jusqu'au bout de la démarche de violence, etc. Et dans certains États, alors qu'il y a la même tentative de gérer les ressortissants, les suspects, et que dans d'autres cas, et donc dans le cas de l'Empire ottoman, bien évidemment, on bascule complètement dans autre chose. Qu'est-ce qui fait la différence dans ces approches à l'égard des suspects de l'intérieur, entre guillemets, des ennemis de l'intérieur? Qu'est-ce qui fait qu'un État, à un moment donné, bascule dans l'absolue horreur?
I mean, one thing is clear, and I think this is also one of these lessons that was learned, you know, war, unfortunately, is an opportunity structure for people to, you know, and we could now go into the whole radicalization of the so-called Armenian question for the young Turks. And there we also would have connecting points to some of the other points you made before. The colonial strategy also of Germany in this region, you know, we don't have time to go into depth, but for me also and other people who worked with the documents by Lepsius and also connected to the Lepsius house in Potsdam have found in many monographs before, what is really shocking is how the German Empire used the Armenian topic to gain a foothold. You know, with Abdul Hamid, you know, you could make the argument the Baghdad railway concession only comes because Wilhelm II, the German emperor, is deciding to travel to the Ottoman Empire right after the Hamidian massacres, the only one, and it was a shock and outrage at the time, you know, even for people in the entourage going with him, it was clear that they're, you know, shaking the hands of the bloody Sultan, that what they're doing is not entirely right. But, you know, the Armenian topic is something already Bismarck before used it, and then Wilhelm II even more. You know, so basically, if you're thinking about the German influence in the Ottoman Empire, really one of the things that opened the door for them and continually kept it open was the Armenian topic. And then, as you perhaps also know, just before World War I starts, Germany aligns itself with the other powers one time, you know, to find a solution and Armenian reforms. And I think this also increases the nervousness of the young Turks, you know, that, you know, with this World War, anyway, there comes an opportunity structure to win back territory, you know, towards the Caucasus. Anyway, that's one of the things, one of the thinking. But the other is, of course, you know, to solve this question, which needs to be solved and is so pressing. And in this context, I saw in the chat function, somebody wanted an example of how this justificationism works. I have a lot in my books from the newspapers, but just for you to know, if you know the basic logic of denialism, Turkish denialism, as it, you know, started in 1915 already, you know, this whole idea of a stab in the back, you know, somebody rising behind the front, helping the enemy, in combination with all these racial characteristics that were put on the Armenians, you know, basically not a productive class, war profiteering, all these things come together. And in the afterwar period, you know, it's basically, it's very similar to how the Nazis talk about the Jews in Germany. That's the way also then the German press talks about the Armenians during World War I, basically. You know, the stab in the back idea, exploitative minority that is unproductive anyway and sucking the lifeblood out of the Ottomans and so on and so forth, you know. And in these texts, what is so shocking, they do make the direct parallels to Germany. It's not something that we historians interpret into the sources. They're telling us that, you know, this is the same as, and we should do as. That's what's so shocking, I think. About
Alors, on a plusieurs questions dans les questions qui nous sont posées par le public, hein, pour lequel je vais prêter ma voix. Une personne qui demande s'il existe une sorte de livre-enquête qui aurait été réalisé pour documenter le génocide au moment des faits, un peu sur le même principe que le livre noir de Vassili Grossman. Est-ce que vous pourriez renvoyer à une documentation ou à des sources ou des publications? Ça, c'est une question de l'une des personnes dans le public. Il y a beaucoup de questions aussi, alors ça n'a rien à voir, sur le négationnisme d'État en Turquie et sur quelles sont éventuellement les avancées dans la société civile, mais aussi dans la société turque, parmi les chercheurs, les politiques ou l'opinion publique. Quelles sont les avancées sur cette question? Est-ce qu'il y en a? Est-ce que c'est encourageant ou pas? Voilà. Donc peut-être faire un point sur un état des lieux sur les avancées ou pas du négationnisme d'État en Turquie.
Okay, I also saw that in the questions, I will try to answer the last one first, what I think about it at least. You know, somebody wrote that because of all the recognitions we have seen in the last years of the Armenian genocide, that something's changed there. I'm still fairly, what do you say, negative on all these developments, just by the simple fact as you take a look at the more general, larger histories and how much of an impact the Armenian genocide makes there. I think I have such a negative view also, basically to say that our battle is not over, even if Germany, France, United States have recognized the genocide. It is important, it's highly important, but so much damage has been done over the last 100 years that, you know, it's interesting that Claire says I'm optimistic about the impact of the Armenian genocide for the 20th century. Well, that again makes me surprised that you find this optimistic, but for me, it's really, you know,
optimistic, but the importance to reintegrate it in the history of the 20th century. That's a positive project.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm always coming back to like how people at the time looked at these topics, you know, how important were they at the time. And it's amazing to see also Turkey in general, how these topics become less and less important. My other book on Ataturk in the Nazi imagination, as an example, early books on the Nazis, they remembered the role of Ataturk for Hitler. And then, you know, books published after the 60s, 70s and 80s, they didn't remember this anyway, because Turkey itself became more marginal in everything. So it's really interesting to see how topics are important, how they're included, you know, and if you're working, for example, with school teachers, you know, what a challenge it is to integrate a topic such as this, you know, where do you have the time and how much time and where you get your context from? It's not easy, you know? It's not easy, and also in many other contexts, you know, of how you teach history and what to do. But I mean, like denialism, and this is also mentioned in one of the chat remarks, it's very powerful in Turkey. When I started with these topics, I was very optimistic to always continue to travel to Turkey with my topics. When I was walking around Istanbul telling people about what I research, people were like, yes, of course, that makes sense. And now I'm pretty much afraid to go there because Erdogan made this alliance with the nationalists and the atmosphere has changed radically. The second book on the Armenian genocide, it was supposed to come out in Turkish too, but I understand that it will take some longer time. I don't know what to tell you, what the outlook for the future will be, but it is quite remarkable that this denialism was so strong and had so many allies across the world. And you know that, you know, I mean, people who work in the field, they know how scared, even after recognition, for example, in Germany, many politicians were to talk about it, and how difficult it is also for many scholars in many different contexts to continue to work on it, you know. And, you know, one of the positive developments, I'm sure, in the last decades, one of the many positive developments, I can hear the translation. How do I do that? is that we have many new scholars coming from Turkey working in these fields, but of course we also know that they had to leave Turkey then after a time, or don't have an immediate chance to go back. So it's an ongoing topic for all of us, I think. When it comes to investigations and a black book and all these things, well, we all know that there are several problems to this dimension. We know that the archives in Turkey itself have been cleansed many times over the last 100 years. Very important archival documents would have existed probably in Germany as well when it comes to also the German participation in the genocide, but they did not survive World War II. Many of them were destroyed in bombing. So for example, for this dimension of the topic, you know, which influence did Germans have on the ground in the Armenian genocide, we know very little. We know of one lower officer who took part in the bombardment of various cities. We have one real admission of involvement only from this newspaper debate I talked about. You know, in one of these newspaper articles, one of the German advisors to the Ottoman Empire in the general staff of the Ottoman Empire, for some reason, he writes in the article without anybody having asked him that they advised the Ottoman government in the Armenian genocide. But other than that, many of the important documents that I'm sure existed at some point do not exist anymore in the German archives. So this is very unfortunate, you know, when archival documents get lost and people do not live anymore and nobody asked them before. Perhaps one day we'll find treasures in the Turkish archives. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about the archives? Au sujet des autres archives de l'allié de l'Allemagne et de la Turquie, l'Empire austro-hongrois. Il y a eu une publication d'ailleurs d'une partie de ces archives. Est-ce qu'il y avait des communications entre les deux alliés germanophones, enfin allemands et austro-hongrois? Et donc, est-ce qu'il y a eu des... voilà, est-ce que vous avez aussi travaillé dans ces archives?
I did not really work on those. They did communicate, but they had a very strange relationship during World War I, these two states. Before World War I, often in documents you find also the Austrians talking of the two German empires, seeing themselves really in a very close relationship to each other. But then during World War I, Germany becomes so dominant in these relations that the Austrians begin to resent the Germans a lot. There's some part in the war when Austrian officers are not even allowed to follow the invitations of the German embassy anymore to events and such. There is also the military attaché of Austria-Hungary, Pomaniowski, who wrote his memoirs also on this time. This is, of course, very important. Yeah, but they have a bit of a strange relationship, and of course Germany had much more involvement, you know, on the ground, had more consuls on the ground, and I didn't mention it here, but it's a really remarkable also development and doesn't go with the trend so easily. That the German consuls in the provinces start protesting the Armenian genocide right from the start, and then their information isn't properly relayed to Berlin because the ambassador has a different view on things. And they're very pro-Armenian, actually, in many of the consulates. One of them, Walter Scheubner-Richter, he wants to try and help his Armenian employees. He organizes food for the deportees. He wants to protest, and he even goes beyond the ambassador, directly communicating to Berlin, breaking hierarchy and protocol. And this guy later on is one of the mentors of Hitler. This is a person who gives Hitler kind of a second home in Munich, where he goes every week and they talk. And also later on, he dies in the Hitler Putsch, this person. It's clear that, you know, this relationship was very formative for Hitler, and that for this person, Walter Scheubner-Richter, the Armenian episode was one of his most important experiences in his life. But we don't know what they talked about. We don't have any documentation for that. We know, for example, that his widow shared an office with Heinrich Himmler for the 1920s. So I'm sure they also talked. There are many such lines, but we don't have enough documentation to really make much of it. You know, we can be sure that people talked about it, that people knew, and that much more of information traveled there, but we can only get so far.
Alors, justement sur les archives, il y a une personne qui demandait s'il y a des choses qui pourraient être retrouvées peut-être du côté des archives russes. Est-ce qu'il y a encore des choses qui ne sont pas encore accessibles aujourd'hui et qui permettraient de documenter certains éléments? Donc ça, c'est une première question. Et puis, il y a une autre question sur le procès de Telerian, quelle a été son influence et sa réception par rapport à la question du génocide sur le plan international au moment du procès en 1921 et puis ensuite tout au long du siècle. Peut-être on peut répondre déjà à ces deux questions.
Well, the Russian archives, I'm not so sure. We always find treasures there, and once more open again, perhaps we are lucky at some point. This would be very nice. It is a strange coincidence that all these documentation on the Armenian genocide was destroyed in bombs. Makes you skeptical, but we don't know for the moment. The Telerian trial was really important, right? I mean, people with an Armenian background know about this trial. It is so important. A movie was made out of it. I mean, there is so much going on there. I want to stress again, basically, how important it was for the German case. You know, it's 100 years right today. I disagree with some of my colleagues in Germany on how to interpret what happened there in the trial. It was a very short and very condensed trial, and it's really fascinating. You know, the documentation of it, the protocol also exists in English, and I think also in French, if I'm not mistaken. It's a really interesting read because you can see from the beginning, basically the judge is pushing the whole thing towards the Armenian genocide. You know, this whole inversion of who's on trial here. Talat Pasha ends up being on trial rather than Telerian. This is quite fascinating, and it was a jury decision. Jury courts were later abolished in Germany, and people always say this was one of the many reasons for it. The jury only answered guilty or not guilty and said no. People sometimes make out of it that it was because of temporary insanity, but the trial, if you read the protocols, it was so much about politics and genocide. I believe they were swayed by, you know, the moral dimensions of the whole thing, not about, you know, temporary insanity. As to the international dimensions, I cannot say much. It's very interesting that the courtroom was booked out right from the beginning. In the weeks before, all the international media wanted to be present there. Many news outlets from the United States and the rest of Europe were in the courtroom. But I'm not quite sure how the story develops then in these countries. I mean, we had Lemkin. This is an international aspect. I'm not quite sure if you read also in German about the trial, but the Polish press would have gotten their information from the German press anyway. Yeah, Claire, of course.
I want to say about Telerian Trial. Oui,
quelques éléments là.
Juste à la fois sur peut-être les archives russes et sur le procès Telerian. J'avais préparé un documentaire sur ce procès avec Bernard Georges et j'avais un peu recherché dans les archives diplomatiques françaises l'écho voilà, des diplomates présents à ce moment-là. Alors c'est intéressant qu'ils en parlent, mais pas tellement. Et en fait, ils en parlent surtout pour regretter que les procès de Leipzig contre les criminels de guerre allemands ne s'attaquent qu'à des sous-fifres, alors qu'au moins dans le cas du procès Telerian, on condamne le principal. Bon, mais ça fait, voilà, c'est un écho indirect, mais qui est instrumentalisé d'une autre façon. Et pour les archives russes, je pense qu'il y a aussi des choses. Malheureusement, la recherche a été longtemps difficile à l'époque soviétique, puisque ce n'était pas un sujet opportun, dans le cadre soit de l'amitié Lénine-Kemal, soit après. Et quand ça a commencé assez tardivement, les archives ne sont pas toujours ouvertes, les archives militaires sont compliquées, il y a les archives de l'état-major du Caucase qui sont à Tbilissi, donc il y a eu les archives d'affaires étrangères sont très difficiles d'accès même pour les chercheurs russes, et surtout les Arméniens soviétiques qui étaient au premier rang pour travailler là-dessus, bien sûr les ont un peu exploités, mais je ne suis pas sûre qu'ils aient pu tout regarder. Il y a même des films films, et alors, en dehors des reportages de guerre qui sont sur le front du Caucase, j'ai repéré 2 films, dont un qui s'appelle L'Orient sanglant, qui a été tourné par Arkatov en 15, qui est cité, mais dont on n'arrive pas à retrouver la trace. On ne sait pas si c'est un reportage, si c'est la fiction. Mais après, la presse, en dehors des archives, la presse en a aussi beaucoup parlé à l'époque. Mais là encore, on voit des attitudes très paradoxales de la Russie. Par exemple, les prisonniers de guerre ottomans arméniens, qui sont sur le front de Sarikamish, vont être expédiés en Sibérie comme les autres Ottomans. Alors il va falloir, quand les Russes rentrent à Trébizonde ou à Erzurum, ils empêchent les Arméniens, les réfugiés arméniens, les rescapés de revenir. Ils refusent de leur restituer leurs biens, voire les femmes enlevées. Enfin, il y a une attitude très compliquée aussi de la Russie, ce sujet qui n'est pas très connu. Et je pense qu'il y a encore, comme disait Stéphane, des trésors d'archives à retrouver. Et ils ont peut-être aussi emporté avec eux des archives allemandes. Ça, comme ils ont récupéré d'autres archives prises par exemple à la France ou ailleurs, et donc il n'est pas exclu que certaines des archives allemandes supposément disparues dans les bombes ne soient pas totalement disparues, mais se retrouvent là-bas aussi.
On a une précision aussi de Céline Goulékian sur justement le procès, puisqu'une conférence s'est tenue hier à ce sujet notamment. Et donc, vous pouvez revoir, le lien vous est indiqué là dans la discussion. Sur le site du projet Ideas and Consequences, vous pouvez retrouver tous ces éléments et réécouter donc la conférence. Sur la question des archives aussi, est-ce qu'il y a des choses qui ont été, est-ce qu'il y a des documents qui ont été travaillés au sein des archives du Vatican? Est-ce qu'il y a des choses accessibles, des choses fermées? Quel a été le rôle de Benoît XV quelle a été la position de Benoît XV par rapport au génocide, puisque c'est lui qui était pape à ce moment-là. Donc, est-ce que vous voulez en dire un petit mot à ce sujet, sur la question du Vatican?
Claire, I didn't work on the Vatican, so I cannot answer really.
Mais il y a des publications, il y a eu plusieurs volumes de publications, des ouvrages, soit à la fois de documents d'archives et d'analyse. Il y a un père jésuite, Ruissen, qui a publié, je ne sais pas, plusieurs volumes sur les archives du secret du Vatican, sur à la fois le génocide des Arméniens, mais aussi sur les Assyro-Chaldéens. Il y a des archives allemandes, dont ici, Gust a fait un gros travail là-dessus. Il y a eu 7 ou 8 volumes des archives austro-hongroises qui avaient été publiées dans les années 70. Il y a toutes les archives américaines qui ont été publiées. Il y a beaucoup d'archives françaises qui sont libres d'accès, etc. Il y a beaucoup d'archives aussi qui sont online, hein, les américaines, les suisses, etc. Aujourd'hui que vous pouvez trouver. Donc, c'est pas les documents et les sources qui manquent, mais ce qu'évoquait plutôt aussi Stéphane, c'est que même la connaissance ne prévient pas, n'empêche pas, ne provoque pas des interventions. Et ce qui était intéressant là-dedans, c'est pas la connaissance des faits qui nous manque ou la connaissance de nouvelles archives, mais c'est comment ces faits, ce que montrait Stéphane, on servait à autre chose, entre guillemets, la connaissance des faits ou les débats sur ces faits, contribuer à justifier des violences, effectivement, au nom de la souveraineté des États, au nom d'une certaine vision de la force des États. Je ne sais pas. Mais c'est pas les sources ne manquent pas, il y en a encore beaucoup. Il y a des sources aussi que sans doute peu exploitées encore en Espagne, dans d'autres pays neutres. Mais il y a beaucoup de choses qui ont été publiées, hein, ou qui sont très faciles d'accès. C'est-à-dire qu'en dehors des pays autoritaires où les ressources pour les historiens sont un peu compliquées, il y a les sources arabes aussi. Puis il y a des archives ottomanes elles-mêmes qui sont restées. J'imagine qu'à Jérusalem, il y a aussi des archives ottomanes, des archives provinciales des zones de l'Empire ottoman, les archives d'Alep, les archives d'Irak. Moi, j'ai trouvé pas mal de choses dans les archives de l'Alliance israélite universelle, d'autres témoins. Donc, c'est vraiment pas ce qui manque.
Il y a une demande aussi pour savoir si
I
vos
wanted
travaux
to.
vont être
Oh,
publiés en français aussi, Stefan Ihrig. Il y a une demande pour savoir si vos travaux vont être publiés en français.
That would be nice. I know I have other countries interested, France so far not. So whatever I can do to help this, sure. I wanted to add something to this, let's say, Christian dimension of everything. What is very interesting to see that in Germany, most of the pro-Armenian activists come from the Protestant side. And that I found in these debates that the Catholic press sometimes is really at pains with itself, how to justify taking basically the German national side and not taking a pro-Christian side. And then already in the 1890s, you find that they're basically arguing, yeah, most of the Armenians anyway, they are like Orthodox, somehow different Christians, you know, so we don't have a responsibility there. There's actually some quotes that say especially that, you know. But of course, the situation is much more difficult. And later on, in the 1920s, I don't find these religious divisions so much anymore. But it's still remarkable that most of these pro-Armenian activists come from Protestant, and many of them are pastors, by the way. You know, I mean, one of the remarkable things about Germany and about Johannes Lepsius, after whom, after all, the institute in Potsdam is named, is that during World War I, he printed his own report after he met with Enver and others, after he got information from the embassy in Constantinople, the German embassy and the American embassy, for example, during World War I, traveled home, wrote his own report on the Armenian situation, the second one, he published one in the 1890s already, and then sent it out by himself, bypassing censorship to all the Protestant pastors in Germany, also to politicians and journalists. But basically every Protestant pastor during World War I had a book with all the available information, more than you could basically have if you weren't an ambassador or foreign minister, and had this information, which I think is really remarkable when you think about the spread of knowledge and ideas. I could talk forever. I think, Pauline, at some point you have to cut me.
Bien. Merci, merci infiniment. Oui, Claire, le micro n'est pas allumé. Je pense qu'on peut, Claire, si vous voulez dire un petit mot, je pense qu'on peut conclure, peut-être un petit mot de conclusion.
Votre micro, Claire, votre micro, en bas à gauche.
Voilà, excusez-moi. Difficile de faire une conclusion sur un sujet si ample et qui ouvre beaucoup de pistes, beaucoup de projets, beaucoup de choses à la fois nouvelles, des choses aussi à creuser, à alimenter la réflexion. Je pense que voilà, déjà la fonction du... le projet de Stéphane et son action pour remettre au centre de la réflexion cet événement dans une partie des grandes évolutions du XXe siècle m'apparaît tout à fait fondamental. On sait quand même déjà beaucoup de choses sur le génocide des Arméniens, sur l'essentiel des faits, il y a encore beaucoup à faire. Il n'y a pas la masse de travaux sur le génocide des Arméniens qu'il y a sur la Shoah. Enfin, je veux dire, ça c'est incontestable, mais néanmoins, je veux dire, les grandes lignes sont connues. Il y a beaucoup d'archives encore à explorer. On manque peut-être plutôt de chercheurs que d'archives ou de documentation. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de choses aussi à faire en Turquie même, et c'est peut-être de là, voilà, Stéphane et moi-même, on a évoqué les jeunes chercheurs qui s'y mettent, et c'est là que ces dernières années, il y a eu les recherches aussi les plus novatrices et importantes. Donc voilà, je pense que c'est un début. Et justement, c'est un peu pour ça que c'est peut-être difficile de conclure sur les propos de Stéphane. Moi, je souhaite aussi fortement que ces ouvrages soient publiés, même si l'anglais reste quand même accessible à beaucoup, mais néanmoins, ça n'a pas tout à fait le même écho, et ça me paraît tout à fait essentiel. Parce que malgré tout, il a raison de dire, les collègues se heurtent souvent à une certaine, je ne dirais pas mépris, mais peut-être condescendance, ou enfin, je veux dire, le sujet n'est pas toujours pris aussi sérieusement, ou considéré de façon aussi importante qu'il le devrait. Après, moi, je mesure le chemin parcouru aussi depuis, je suis très vieille, hein, depuis ces 50 dernières années où quand j'étais en classe, il n'y avait pas une seule ligne, on n'en parlait jamais. Quand j'étais à la fac, on n'en parlait pas, voilà, ou alors au massacre à l'oriental ou tout ce que vous voulez. Quand dans la presse, il n'y avait rien. Et parti du néant, enfin, le sujet est revenu aussi au centre des débats. Alors, bien utilisé, mal utilisé, je ne sais pas, enfin, mais il y a eu quand même d'énormes progrès en matière et de connaissances et d'intérêt pour la question au cours de ces dernières décennies. Donc, c'est aussi assez inattendu. Et d'une certaine façon, on a commencé à remettre le génocide des Arméniens dans l'histoire européenne, dans l'histoire en France, parce que c'est aussi, voilà, c'est passé dans une guerre mondiale, donc tout le monde était impliqué. Et c'est aussi, et au-delà, je pense aussi voilà, dans l'histoire des protagonistes même en Turquie. Hein, je veux dire, certes, le négationnisme est très actif, mais ne serait-ce que parce que le négationnisme est actif, ça fait, il y a des débats, il y a des discussions, il y a des, voilà. Donc, je suis pas totalement pessimiste non plus.
Très bien.
Je ne sais pas si Stéphane est d'accord ou pas.
I'm actually very optimistic, I have to say, very, very much so. As I said, also, I think like in the last 20 years, you can see there is this consolidation. We have these, I don't know, mega historians, really, Remo Kevorkian, for example, you know, with a book like this, you know, which is so detailed, so many different language archives and sources, you know, we don't have to circle around the question, was it, wasn't it anymore. And I think also now with these new developments in recognition, it will free up some energy, you know, not only the young people who are doing new topics, I think we can be much more relaxed presenting the topic to the world. And I think the world should be more relaxed talking to all these various experts, you know. The field of Armenian studies didn't have it easy in the last decades, let's say, many decades. But there is so much expertise there. There is so much people who have so much to say, also really important for so many other fields, you know. A context like ours today with the memorial or the whole conference program, I think these things are very important, and we have to continue with all of them. For the years being, we have to basically ignore a little bit what's happening in Turkey, but even there I'm optimistic. You know, one of the things is these books are there in the libraries and in the bookstores. All the major international books on the Armenian genocide did get translated, you know, so it's not something that's, you know, there's no clear divide here. So I am optimistic, you know, and I think this wave of recognition can free up some energy to find different connecting points. We don't have to, the comparison, for example, we don't have to do always, and I think various researchers have also shown how it is embedded in other wider contexts, how it is relevant for so many questions across the 20th century. So I am actually optimistic, you know, I am. Thank you so much for having us and me.
Bien.
Merci aussi aux organisateurs.
Merci
et à Stéphane.
Infiniment à tous les deux. Merci au public d'avoir été présent. Et je vous dis à très bientôt. Merci.
Bye bye.